you give us an idea what the overall steps look like when you first start working with a team or an individual, to give people a sort of an idea what that process might look like?
It's a great question, and one that when I reflect back of thinking of walking in the room for the first time and thinking, this is going to be different from now on. Because previously we would used to run meetings or development sessions and we just focus on what are we going to be doing? What was the work? What was the data? What was the feedback? As opposed to how are we doing this? And you had a number of poor behaviors in the room, someone at the back with their arms crossed who's not interested, or some of those meeting corrosive behaviors where you get somebody not saying anything, but they're going, what are they going on about? And I remember the moment where I'm in the room and thinking, this is it. This is the moment where I've got to put a stop to it. And my heart rate was going high. And I thought, I've got to call it out. Now, it's not that I wouldn't recommend it for everybody. It could be that you take somebody aside and say, this is the standard that I'm now expecting, particularly the people that are really influential in a team, or the ones that can change the meeting dynamic on a sixpence. When they're in a bad mood or they're having a bad day, everybody else has a bad day. But I just tackled it and said, look, this is a behavior that I can't accept. I really want the most positive, forward-thinking team possible, and that doesn't mean pulling our punches. We've got to have challenging conversations. Sometimes when you go into a team and everyone's just happy and lovely and comfortable, it's often a little bit stagnant. They're not really having the difficult conversations. And so finding a way to be brave and positive when you're able to call a question out or a challenge.
What is one of the most common psychological limitation or a drawback from within the athlete?
Well, there are plenty, but one of the factors that I think is perhaps most interesting is that when I first started working with high performers, and you've got Olympic champions, and they're often much bigger than me, and taller and more muscular and more powerful, so they could swat me out the way if they needed to. I went into that environment away at training camps, and they're working hard, and I'm looking around thinking, where's the confidence? Where is it? I thought they would all be high-fiving each other and woohoo, we're going to do this, we're going to smash this. And I was quite surprised to hear, I'm not good enough, I'm worried, I'm concerned. And as a scientist, for example, I was measuring a lot of what they were doing, and they were constantly asking me for feedback as to, was I good enough? And so in support of athletes, you have to boost confidence. And that is critical for you to perform a given task. So this is something from a psychological point of view that's called self-efficacy. That is the belief that I can do the thing that's in front of me. Self-efficacy isn't something that you can just expect to magic out of thin air. Self-efficacy is something that you have to nurture. So, for example, the best indication that you can become Olympic champion is that you've become world champion. The best indication you become world champion is European champion or Southeast Asia champion. And there are increments along the way. A lot of people will just look at what's in front of them and forget what they've achieved. So it's important.
That is a really good point. That is a really, really good point. And thank you for pointing that out as well, because in addition to that, it's a continuum, isn't it? It's not all or nothing, and it's also not all the things that we've forgotten from before or only focused on one very small aspect.
Yeah, a climber takes one step up each time. They don't bound up. They don't just take a magic leap. They take a step from where they are and the next logical step forward. And an athlete nurtures its confidence from everything that they've achieved.
It looks like Gordon has a question, and Gordon, I think you're going to need to unmute yourself if you're going to try and ask that question. So could you maybe ask Steve your question?
maybe two questions. We'll see if I can get them in. One, you had talked about these high goals and expectations as part of this like Olympic bid where the result, it seems, was like fear, threat, resistance. And then you proceeded to talk about like distinctions between low performing and high performing teams. And I'm just curious, with high goals and expectations, is it productive for teams to be experiencing fear and threat and resistance if they are indeed high performing teams? Like, is that fuel for high performing teams? I couldn't make that link myself. Maybe I'll just pause there.
Oh, it's a really interesting one. So we're all hardwired to feel threat and chase reward. And so that's a very important dynamic for us to recognize. Some of the best performers that as I've sort of talked about, it's not just about this wild optimism. It's about a really grounded reality of where we are. And if you feel that threat, the high performers do one thing more than worry, is they say, now what am I going to do? And so a goal, there are two distinct versions of a goal. We've got the high up on the mountain, 66 medals, 121 medals, which is what we call a distal goal. It's far out in the distance. It's the top of the summit. But there's also a proximal goal, which is, and what am I going to do today that's in front of me? And so the two have to be complementary. It's whether the crazy goal, the fear one, can overwhelm you into paralysis. That's the distinction. And choosing a sort of a more human, integrated, holistic approach of thinking, let's hear what those fears are. Because as a leader, it's very easy to initiate fear and threat, and then your workforce says, well, I'm not going to bother. I'm just not going to do anything. And that in itself suppresses human function, as opposed to thinking, what am I going to do that can move me forward?
No matter how small the work world, we also need to consider costs in deciding what changes to make and which don't make sense. What method do you recommend leaders to utilize in making these decisions?
Great question. And so there are some very simple ways, decision-making matrices that we use for that. Every marginal gain isn't necessarily desirable, particularly if the gain is costly in terms of time, effort, finding out whether it's going to apply to you. So what we tend to do is divide into a 2x2 matrix here, where we're thinking about return versus the risk return. So what we're looking for is low risk, high return. That's the place that we're gonna spend most of our time. And it's some of the boring stuff. It's about sleeping well, eating well, recovering well. Some of these things that actually lever a lot of human engagement in recovery and performance. Then you've got high risk, high reward. So it's worth exploring, and that's where you'd put more meticulous research and exploratory. You take time to find out whether something is working or not. And then low risk, low reward. You might still start exploring some of those. High risk, low reward. What you're doing, you shouldn't be there.
And her question is, what advice do you give a leader with high demands to create time to listen and engage with team members, despite feeling like that is the last thing they have time for?
I would urge you to make time for it. Leaders are ultimately, and I think every single leadership book there is, as I've seen some extensive research on this, is based on Fleischmann's model of management, which is, how do I hold the task in hand and I take the people with me? And this maps to one of our deeply held psychological functions of whether I'm agreeable or not. And so I want to get stuff done, but I've also got to take people with me. And it's not a seesaw. It's not either or. It's not just task at the expense of people. It's not just people at the expense of task. You can do both. And so I would probably, in a very simple summary way of thinking, if I'm being asked to do a lot, I've also got to make sure I'm connecting with the people as to how we're going to be doing this and that they're in balance and moving forward.
And ultimately, I guess that's the definition of a team, isn't it? The leader is part of that team.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not going to go anywhere fast without a team behind you.